The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for 3 days after Grandpa Joe's funeral. Inside was his last gift to me, the deed to our family's old farm in West Texas. 200 acres of supposedly worthless land that had been in our family for 4 generations. My in-laws couldn't stop talking about what a burden it would be. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how my grandfather's worthless inheritance turned into a $50 million lesson in doing your homework before judging someone else's legacy. You should just sell it, my mother-in-law Margaret had said at the funeral reception, picking at her chicken salad with perfectly manicured nails. That old place hasn't produced anything worthwhile in decades. We'll take it off your hands for a fair price. I nodded politely, too grief-stricken to argue. Grandpa Joe had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8. That dusty old farmhouse was where I'd learned to ride a horse, where I'd done my homework at the ancient kitchen table, where I'd listened to his stories about our family's history in the oil business before the wells ran dry in the 1960s. Really, Sarah? My husband Tom chimed in, ever eager to please his mother. It makes sense. The property taxes alone will eat us alive. And what are we going to do with a ranch 5 hours from Houston? I finally opened the envelope on a quiet Wednesday morning. Inside, along with the deed, was a handwritten letter in Grandpa Joe's shaky script. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I've finally gone to join your grandmother and your parents. Don't waste too many tears on me. I've lived a good long life, and I'm leaving you what might turn out to be the most valuable thing I own, if you're smart enough to look deeper than the surface. The farm's been in our family since your great-great-grandfather James Mitchell struck oil there in 1923. The wells ran dry years ago, or so everyone thinks, but old James was cleverer than people gave him credit for. He knew something about that land that even my father never figured out. In my desk drawer at the farm, you'll find a red leather book. It's got all the answers you need if you take the time to really study it. Don't let anyone pressure you into selling until you've read every page. Love always, Grandpa Joe. B.S. Don't trust the Robinson brothers. They've been sniffing around the property for years, and there's a reason why. I drove out to the farm that weekend, ignoring Tom's complaints about wasting gas. The old house stood just as I remembered it. Weathered white clapboard, wrap-around porch with a creaky swing, ancient oak tree shading the west side. The key was still hidden in the fake rock by the back door. Inside, everything was covered in dust sheets. The furniture we'd moved out when Grandpa Joe went into the nursing home 2 years ago left ghost-like impressions on the wooden floors. I made my way to his study, where the massive oak desk still dominated the room. The red leather book was exactly where he said it would be, along with a stack of old maps, geological surveys, and what looked like original land grant documents from the 1920s. I settled into his old leather chair and began to read. 4 hours later, my hands were shaking as I closed the book. If what I was seeing was correct, Grandpa Joe and great-great-grandpa James had left me something far more valuable than anyone suspected. My phone buzzed. Another text from Tom. Mom wants to know what he thought about her offer. $50,000 is more than fair for that old place. I smiled, thinking about what I just learned. The original oil wells on the property had indeed run dry, but they had only tapped the upper layer of deposits. The geological surveys in the Red Book, updated secretly by Grandpa Joe just 5 years ago, showed massive untapped reserves in deeper formations that could only be reached with modern drilling technology. But that wasn't even the most valuable part. The original mineral rights agreement, which everyone thought had expired in the 1970s, had actually been renewed and expanded by Grandpa Joe through a complex series of legal maneuvers. The rights covered not just our 200 acres, but a vast tract of surrounding land, over 2,000 acres in total. The Robinson brothers, who owned the neighboring ranch, had been trying to buy our property for years. Now I understood why. They discovered the deeper oil deposits and had been quietly buying up surrounding properties. But without our mineral rights, they couldn't drill. I was still processing this information when another text came through, this time from Margaret. Coming over for dinner tonight. Need to discuss the farm situation. Perfect timing. I'd already scheduled a meeting with BlackRock Oil for Monday morning. Their preliminary estimates of the deposits, based on the surveys I've found, were staggering. But tonight's dinner would be interesting for other reasons. I arrived at Tom and Margaret's sprawling River Oaks mansion at exactly 7:00 p.m. The whole family was there, Tom's sisters Amanda and Beth with their husbands, his father George looking uncomfortable in his smoking jacket, and Margaret holding court in her designer dress and diamonds. "Sarah, darling," she cooed as I walked in, "we've been so worried about you, rattling around that old farmhouse by yourself. Have you given any thought to our offer?" I smiled, accepting a glass of wine. "Actually, I have. But first, tell me why you're so interested in the property." "Pure charity," she replied smoothly. "We hate to see you burdened with that worthless land. The taxes, the upkeep, it's really not something someone of your background should have to deal with." My background. She never let me forget that I'd grown up on that farm, that I'd attended state school on a scholarship while Tom had gone to Yale, that I was, in her eyes, perpetually inferior. "The Robinsons stopped by yesterday," Tom added. "They're willing to go to $75,000. Really, Sarah, you should consider it." I took a slow sip of wine. The Robinsons. Interesting. Have they mentioned anything about their recent geological surveys? The room got very quiet. Margaret's perfectly Botox forehead tried to furrow. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "No. That's odd, because they've spent quite a bit of money surveying the area. They seem very interested in what's about 5,000 feet below the surface." Tom's father, George, suddenly started coughing. He'd made his money in oil. Back in the day, he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Now, Sarah," Margaret began, her voice taking on that condescending tone I'd grown to hate, "you really shouldn't go filling your head with nonsense. That land was played out decades ago. Everyone knows that." I pulled out my phone and pulled up the email I'd received that afternoon from BlackRock Oil. "Everyone might need to revise their assumptions. Would you like to know what they're offering for just the mineral rights?" "This is ridiculous," Tom burst out. "Mother's trying to help you, and you're spinning fairy tales about oil wells." I stood up, smoothing my dress. "The meeting's on Monday at 10 a.m. You're welcome to attend, Tom. After all, as my husband, you should be there when they present their final offer. Though you might want to sit down when they get to the number of zeros." "How dare you?" Margaret sputtered. "After all we've done for you." "All you've done," I interrupted quietly, "is treat me like a charity case to married above her station. But Grandpa Joe taught me something valuable. Never judge a book by its cover, or a farm by its surface." I walked to the door, then turned back. "Oh, and Margaret, that $50,000 offer, you might want to add a few zeros. After Monday, the price is going up significantly." The last thing I saw as I walked out was George's face, white as a sheet, as he finally understood exactly what he'd almost let slip through his fingers. The real fun would begin Monday morning. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect Texas day for changing lives. I arrived at BlackRock Oil's downtown Houston offices at 9:45 a.m., dressed in my best suit, not the outlet mall bargains Margaret always criticized, but a tailored Armani I'd bought specially for this meeting. Sometimes appearances matter. The conference room windows offered a spectacular view of the city skyline. I sat calmly reviewing my documents while waiting for the others to arrive. Right on cue, at 9:55, Tom burst in with Margaret and George in tow. "This is completely unnecessary," Margaret declared, smoothing her designer dress. "I've already spoken to our attorney about contesting the inheritance." "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Carter," a new voice interrupted. James Davidson, CEO of BlackRock Oil, walked in flanked by his executive team. "We've thoroughly reviewed the ownership documents. Ms. Mitchell's claim to both the property and mineral rights is ironclad." I suppressed a smile as Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes. Tom just looked confused, while George, ever the wellman, was studying Davidson with growing comprehension. "Shall we begin?" Davidson suggested, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Ms. Mitchell, we've completed our preliminary surveys based on the data you provided. Would you like me to share the results with your family?" "Please do," I said quietly. "I think I'll find it enlightening." Davidson nodded to his chief geologist, who pulled up a complex 3D imaging display of the land beneath my farm. "What you're looking at," he explained, "is one of the largest untapped oil deposits we've discovered in Texas in the last decade. Conservative estimates put the recoverable reserves at over 100 million barrels." The room went deadly quiet. George let out a low whistle. He knew exactly what those numbers meant. But the wells ran dry years ago," Tom protested weakly. The surface wells, yes, the geologist agreed. But your wife's great-great-grandfather was quite clever. He suspected the existence of deeper deposits but lacked the technology to reach them. The original wells were essentially a smokescreen, allowing him to secure mineral rights to a much larger area, while everyone thought the land was worthless. I pulled out Grandpa Joe's red leather book. He documented everything in here. The geological formations, the legal strategies, even the long-term plan. My grandfather updated the surveys and quietly renewed the rights every decade, waiting for drilling technology to catch up with his great-grandfather's vision. The mineral rights, George said slowly, how far do they extend? Davidson smiled. That's the truly brilliant part. The original agreement covers not just the Mitchell farm, but a 2,000-acre radius, including, I believe, the land recently purchased by the Robinson brothers. Margaret's perfectly lined lips formed a smile of shock. The Robinsons had spent millions buying up surrounding properties, never realizing that without my mineral rights, their investments were virtually worthless. Our initial offer, Davidson continued, sliding a folder across the table, is $50 million for a 30% stake in the development rights, with an additional 15% of ongoing production royalties. Tom actually fell back in his chair. Margaret grabbed the folder with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the details. Of course, Davidson added, the Robinsons have also made inquiries, but we prefer to work with the actual rights holder. He smiled at me. Your grandfather spoke very highly of you, Ms. Mitchell. He mentioned you had a degree in geological engineering. Now it was my turn to be surprised. You knew my grandfather? We had several interesting conversations over the years. He wanted to make sure we'd be ready to move when the time was right. He was quite insistent that we wait until after certain events had played out. I felt tears threatening. Even from beyond the grave, Grandpa Joe had been looking out for me, making sure I'd have allies when the truth came out. This is absurd, Margaret suddenly burst out. She can't possibly manage something of this magnitude. Tom, as her husband. Actually, I interrupted. According to Texas inheritance law and the specific terms of my grandfather's will, the property and mineral rights are mine alone. Tom has no legal claim to them. I turned to my husband, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. Though we should probably discuss that, along with some other aspects of our relationship. The next few hours were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and increasingly desperate attempts by Margaret to regain control of the situation. But the documentation was perfect. Grandpa Joe and his father before him had made sure of that. By the end of the day, I had signed a preliminary agreement with BlackRock, filed for divorce from Tom, and begun the process of relocating back to the farm. The look on Margaret's face when she realized she'd spent years mocking what would become a billion-dollar property was almost worth all the humiliation she'd put me through. Almost. The aftermath was everything you might expect. Tom alternated between begging forgiveness and threatening lawsuits. Margaret had to be escorted from my office at BlackRock when she showed up demanding to be cut in on the deal. The Robinsons tried to contest the mineral rights but quickly backed down when their lawyers reviewed the documentation. I moved back to the farm that weekend. The house needed work, but that was fine. I had plans for it. Big plans. 1 month after the BlackRock meeting, I hosted a dinner party. The old dining room had been beautifully restored, the antique table polished to a mirror shine. My guests included James Davidson, his wife, and several key members of the development team. We were celebrating the first successful test well. As we sat down to dinner, Davidson raised his glass. To Sarah Mitchell, he said, and to Joe Mitchell, who knew exactly what he was doing when he left his legacy in her hands. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I opened Grandpa Joe's red book again. A loose page fell out, one I somehow hadn't noticed before. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Sarah. By now you've discovered what the land is really worth. But that's not the most valuable thing I'm leaving you. The real inheritance is the lesson. Never let anyone tell you what you're worth. Your great-great-grandfather knew it when everyone thought you was crazy for buying this worthless land. I knew it when I watched you grow up into someone who could handle this responsibility. And now you know it too. They'll try to take it from you, of course. The Robinsons, the in-laws, maybe even Tom. But you're a Mitchell. We don't give up what's ours, and we don't let others define our worth. Make it count, sweetheart. Love, Grandpa Joe. 6 months later, the first production well went online. Standing at the site, watching the machinery pump liquid gold from deep beneath the earth, I thought about worth. The worth of land, of family legacy, of self-respect. Margaret still lives in River Oaks, though she's been notably absent from social events since the story broke. Tom moved to California with his new girlfriend. The Robinsons sold their properties at a loss and retired to Florida. And me, I split my time between Houston, where I oversee our partnership with BlackRock, and the farm, which I've restored to its former glory. The house is filled with light and life again, just as Grandpa Joe would have wanted. Last week, I hosted a group of female engineering students from Texas A&M, showing them around the operation and sharing what I've learned about the oil business and about life. The land looks pretty ordinary, one of them commented, gazing out over the seemingly empty plains. I smiled, remembering another time someone had judged by appearances. That's the thing about worth, I told her. Sometimes you have to dig deep to find it, but it's always there, waiting to be discovered. The Mitchell farm is now the centerpiece of one of the most productive oil developments in Texas. The initial wells exceeded even BlackRock's optimistic projections, and our partnership has expanded to cover the entire mineral rights area. But the real story isn't about oil or money. It's about legacy, about seeing beyond the surface, about standing up to those who would define your worth by their own limited vision. Every morning, I have coffee on the porch swing, watching the sun rise over land that 4 generations of Mitchells loved and protected. The oil pumps work quietly in the distance, turning Grandpa Joe's faith into reality. On my office wall hangs a simple frame containing a check for $50,000, Margaret's generous offer for the farm. Next to it is a recent financial statement showing the property's current value. The difference between those numbers isn't just about money. It's about the price of underestimating someone's worth. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear Grandpa Joe laughing.